Hello to everyone who is introducing themselves in the chat box. Please feel free to do so. And welcome again. It's just after 2 o'clock, and we have 2 hours together this afternoon. So I think we're going to get started. I'm so grateful that you have all taken the time this afternoon to connect with us, to share with us, to learn with us, particularly given this critical topic. We're really looking forward to welcoming some incredible guests for today's conversation. So welcome to our webinar, Supporting Youth Wellbeing in the Climate Crisis, Critical Understandings and Hopeful Practices. My name is Katie Rogers, and I'm the Knowledge Exchange Director at Youth Research and Evaluation Exchange, or YouthREX. To open today's event, we're actually going to begin with a spoken word performance from Robyn Kaur Sidhu. I'm really excited to introduce you all to Robyn, and I also encourage you to read more about Robyn and all of our guests on our website. Robyn is a queer, mad, disabled Punjabi poet. They have performed their feelings on stages across Turtle Island in the United Kingdom. They are the creative director of Hot Damn, It's a Queer Slam, a member of the League of Canadian Poets, and a former director for the Voices of Today Youth Poetry Festival. They are a youth arts educator of consent, race, 2S LGBTQ+ identity, poetry, and visual arts. And they are trying to be the adult they needed as a kid. Please join me in welcoming Robyn.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. It's so wonderful to be here. My name is Robyn. My pronouns are she, he, and they used interchangeably. I'm a spoken word poet and educator, and I think before I get started with sharing my work, I really want to take a moment and talk about my lineage and talk about my relationship to the land, because you can't have conversations on climate crisis and climate change without involving Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous wisdom. So I currently hold the most privilege because I live and work in Toronto, which is home to many nations, including the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, the Mississaugas of the Credit. I come from a Punjabi background, so Punjab is in India, and my family fled Punjab and India due to a lot of state-sanctioned violence that the government was carrying out specifically on Sikh people. My family moved out to England, then here in Canada, specifically Brampton. So I'm Peel alumni, love that for me. Yeah, and so I think it's really important to also acknowledge that spoken word poetry is a form of oral storytelling that originates in many communities of color, specifically in Indigenous communities, as well as beat poetry originates in Black communities. So when we think about poetry, oftentimes we think about old dead white men and Shakespeare and, you know, the kind of poetry we kind of grilled through in high school, but poetry is so much more than that. If you're Toronto based, I highly recommend checking out the Toronto Poetry Slam. They are a wonderful space. I used to work with Lakeshore Arts. Specifically, I used to run their Youth Climate Collective program last year, and it was really wonderful to be able to talk about well-being around climate crisis and the environment with a bunch of young people and do that through art and through storytelling. I feel like oftentimes storytelling feels a little bit easier to have big conversations through art. So my first poem is called Earth Spine, and I don't share this one very often, so I'm really excited that I get to today. New Horizon hair. Dawn break bangs, the shoulders are now weightless. I cut off all my hair, but I miss the way it used to hold me, but now my shoulders are free. Weight moves down body, and I have a solid rock spine. Chronic pain, back breaks like I am carrying my foremother's postures, farmland stance. Mama still lives in this marrow and the memory of a farm, and this curve of spinal fluid is ours. Covered in soil and routine and time hunched us over. This body comes from maternal womb, and this is mama's blood, all of it. And this body shame is hand-me-down too, but how can I curse the arc of bone, the way these bodies withered with generations, and I come out of the uterus ready to tend the land I sprouted from. I outstretch fingers like sunlight. I stretch and reach out for a home only my body remembers, and I stick fingers in damp earth. And she holds my hand too. and her pain travels up my spine next to my own, and it's loose like clay. Is moldable in the morning, and spine dries and cracks when the sun sets. Is as loud as motherland mourning our migration west. And my body is too heavy to float in the ocean that separates us. Spines drown in the body like saplings in monsoon season, torn out from its roots. The act of being teared out is hereditary, and this displacement is my mama's too. Yeah. Oftentimes when I think about climate crises and well-being, I really think about my body. And as a disabled person, obviously, like, there's such a big comparison between the way we treat our bodies and the way we treat the environment. And it's really interesting thinking about lineage, because there are a lot of places in the earth that I connect to and that my family's from that I don't get to see or hear from. And so, yeah, I'm in my mid-20s, and I'm a child of immigrants, and that means that I am consistently having an identity crisis about my identity, how I fit into community here, how I fit into diaspora. So this is just my second and last poem. And this is a poem about all the places I could have been born instead of Montreal, Canada. September 7th, 1999, Southampton, England. Here, my grandfather never chooses to uproot the family and spread sugarcane roots into Canada, and I grow up on Denzel Avenue, a Sidhu family home that has raised us all, and I have an accent thick enough to drown in. I spend my Saturdays working at my granddad's shop. I stop angsty British teenagers from stealing sweets. And here, my mother's bones are always damp because of the English rain. Here she trades shy paneer for Scotch eggs instead of poutine, and my father does not drop out of college. He works at a bank. He is more stock market than shelf stalker, and I still grow up cheering Liverpool FC instead of Southampton, and I grew up to be a dirty soccer player. I dig cleats into every boy who has ever hurt me. Here, I grow up surrounded by family. My younger cousins recognize me, and I am the older sister that the ocean never swallowed whole. September 7th, 1999, Calgary, Alberta. Here, my mother and father choose to stay. They build their first home in a city that cannot make up its mind about the weather or immigrants. And here, my mother's fingertips are blue from the cold instead of stained yellow because of holiday here. She learns how to chameleon herself in the prairies. And my father works for an air conditioning company. He works long days assembling machines. He learns that small parts play an important role in the bigger picture. And here, I am sprouting into the stampede. I am a wild thing worth knowing. September 7th, 1999, Punjab, India. Here, my great-grandparents do not believe in the promise of a new world. They choose to raise their 8 children in the same place their family has lived for centuries. And they do not cut off their ties to the motherland or their turbans. And here, I'm not Robyn. I am Simran or Rajpreet or Gurpreet or Rajinder. I am named after a grandmother, I think, and my mom is still a professor of Punjabi literature. And I grew up thinking poets can be sun-kissed too, and the days are as long as my hair. I am a baptized Sikh. I flash my kirpan under the chin of every man who thinks himself conqueror. September 7th, 1999. Nowhere. Here, my mother and father never meet on a rooftop. Here, in Punjab, my mother marries the boy next door, or she continues her career as a professor and eventually runs the whole university. She mothers every bright young thing that enters her office. She learns everything there is to know about anything, or she takes up the Catholic faith and becomes a nun. Swears celibacy like she sometimes tells me she should have done when my brother and I bother her too much. Here, in Southampton, my father becomes a soccer player. He looks good in red and on the cover of sports magazines. He is half smile charming, and his face is plastered on every wall in the country. Or he too thinks about his family, calls a new shoreline home every few years. He has even more of an identity crisis than I do, or he does immigrate across the ocean to Montreal. He holds on to the first love of his life. He flips burgers while she works on becoming a paramedic. When she saves him from his first bad high, he says, "I love you back," and he marries someone my grandfather does not approve of. Here, I am just the wish of a someday daughter. Thanks for having me, folks. I think it's so important when we think about our well-being and our connection to land that we really think about migration and where our families come from, and how being a settler gives us so much more responsibility to be checking in with the way we treat the land, but also our cross-cultural solidarity with Indigenous folks, and really making sure that we listen to the stewards of the land. Yeah, I feel like thinking about how my family is called home, called a lot of different places home, and how that gives us the responsibility to care for our home. Yeah, but thank you so much for having me, folks. That's it for me.
Thank you so much, Robyn. We do at YouthREX appreciate the opportunity to bring in the arts, to bring in performance, to bring in poetry. And one of my conversations with one of our guests, we were talking about how poetry can allow us to access and express truths that we may not be able to get to through any other means. Thinking about the ways in which well-being is holistic and how we have to integrate different aspects of ourselves and also integrate our relationships and our relationships with nature, with the world. Yeah, that was so wonderful. Thank you so much. This is a really great moment to segue into, I think, what Laura is going to share. I think what Laura will share is going to pick up on a lot of what Robyn shared, and it's going to really ground us for the conversations to follow. And so in thanking Robyn, I'm also really excited to introduce you to one of our special guests, Laura Glover. Laura is a youth worker, a therapist, a researcher, and a PhD student in the School of Social Work at York University, and is also a former research assistant at YouthREX, where we worked closely together. And Laura is going to share with you some of the key takeaways from an evidence brief that will explore understandings and practices that hopefully we can all bring to our work with youth and bring to our conversations today. So Laura, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Robyn. That was beautiful. So I'll start with introducing sort of just a brief conceptualization of how this evidence brief and our work in the Knowledge Exchange Program has taken up youth work and its relationship to well-being and the climate crisis. Our hope is to offer this evidence brief sort of to get us on the same page as a starting point. And of course, when we lead into the discussion, we will cross-pollinate, we will co-create, and we will share. So when we talk about youth work, we are taking it up from a critical perspective. Critical youth work practice is predicated on principles of open engagement, informal education, relationship building, and flexibility. And it resists reproducing harmful and marginalizing power dynamics. So this approach to youth work seeks to redress the socially divisive imbalance of power in society, and to embody the fundamental values of democracy, justice, and equality, and ultimately to decolonize practice. And of course, when we're talking about decolonizing practice, borrowing from Dr. Eve Tuck's brilliant work, we are not talking about decolonization in metaphorical terms. We are talking about it in applicable, practical terms, which I'll speak a little bit more about a little later. Youth work then is an important site for supporting, bolstering, and amplifying youth-led understandings of well-being in relation to the climate crisis, and for promoting agency by engaging youth in global social, political, and environmental issues at the local level. So we developed this evidence brief first. This is all pulled from relevant literature and research, which is like constantly evolving in this topic area, just so exciting. So we've started with 6 key understandings, and then we move into 5 promising practices. And I just want to say from the outset that although this evidence brief is and was designed with youth work as the context in mind and as a practice tool for youth workers, I think really it is relevant to you know, anyone who has a relationship with young people and for young people themselves. So, that could include therapists, parents, aunties, soccer coaches. I think this is really reflective of our way of being in relationship with young people, with each other in the context of the climate crisis. So our first key understanding, climate change is a crisis and youth are uniquely impacted. So we're not here to debate whether or not climate change is happening. We believe climate scientists, and we understand climate change as an urgent political, social, economic, environmental, and existential issue with structural roots in colonialism and in capitalism. And so what do we mean when we say its structural roots are in colonialism and capitalism? So if we think about settler colonialism, we know that it is a relationship to land, people, non-human species that is fundamentally rooted in extreme violence, theft, extraction, exploitation. It is not respectful, it is not regenerative, it is not reciprocal, and it is not restorative. We understand that capitalism is the dominant global economic system that sells the land's resources for profit on the market. It disproportionately impacts people depending on access to power and privilege. And this is fundamentally in conflict with living respectfully and in reciprocity with the planet. And so youth well-being is uniquely impacted by this crisis. Young people have limited access to institutional power to intervene in it and are set to inherit the worst of its effects. And so when we're thinking about the effects of climate change on youth mental health and well-being, I find it helpful to think about it sort of in two sort of separate buckets that are not completely separate. Of course, there is overlap. But we can think about the direct effects of the climate crisis on youth mental health as including living through a weather event. So weather events like floods, wildfires, heat waves, winter storms, tornadoes are increasing as climate change progresses. And so youth mental health can be impacted by these weather events when young people live through them. But we also think about indirect effects. So these would include the ongoing threat of unstable futures, biodiversity loss, species extinction, which, by the way, what I find so inspiring and hopeful about research that includes young people as participants is that consistently you see young people mentioning their concern for other species. So we know that young people are not just thinking about human beings, they're also thinking about the other species in which we share this planet with. Other indirect effects include potential limits on reproductive choices. We know that there is an intersection between reproductive justice and the climate crisis. So for example, young people report wondering if they will ever be parents, if they will be able to parent in a safe or sustainable environment. We also know that reproductive justice includes the right to choose to parent, the right to choose to be pregnant, to not be pregnant, and that these areas intersect with the climate crisis as well. Other indirect effects include uninterrupted access to information about the climate crisis on social media. So youth are really inundated with information while at the same time having limited access to institutional power to intervene. Youth experience sadness, helplessness, guilt, distress, anxiety, worry, and feelings of betrayal by governments in positions of power. Okay, so number 2. Thanks, James. Climate justice centers reconciliation with Indigenous communities and advances decolonization. So the framework of collective liberation that guides critical youth work acknowledges that responses to the climate crisis must always align with Indigenous-led initiatives and the work of Indigenous knowledge keepers, water protectors, and land defenders in practice. Reconciliation includes renewing healthy relationships that are based on honesty, mutual respect, and an understanding of identity. And youth workers can and ought to center the experiences, perspectives, worldviews, histories, and narratives of Indigenous youth. Number 3, well-being is holistic. So well-being is not one thing. It is expansive. It includes physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual dimensions, and it is also self-defined. We understand well-being as a process that youth work is involved in supporting, affirming, and co-creating with youth. It is a complex relational interplay between youth workers, and youth work spaces, and the broader social structures and systems in which we all are a part. Well-being is contextualized on the individual, community, and collective levels, and these levels are inseparable from the ecosystems of which we, are a part of, meaning that when land, water, and non-human species are impacted by climate change, so are youth. Number 4, youth identities are intersectional. Youth are not a homogeneous group. The effects of climate change on youth well-being vary and are disproportionate depending on a young person's social location. And so what do we mean when we say social location? Social location is a combination of identity factors, which can include, but is not limited to, gender, race, ability, class, sexual orientation, and age. Youth also have various strengths and knowledge in relation to the climate crisis, its effects, and possible solutions. Recognizing this intersectionality to understand the diversity and complexities of youth relationships to the climate crisis can bolster and amplify strengths and challenges in localized and specific ways. And lastly, an intersectional lens provides youth workers with a tool to engage critically with power relations and structural barriers that may impact youth. And of course, the theory of intersectionality comes from Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. Number 5, youth are the experts of their own experiences. So with that being said, there is no one size fits all to supporting young people in the climate crisis. Young people are diverse. We all arrive to this work in different ways, from diverse perspectives, within the context of diverse programs, relationships. But one thing is true, and that is young people have a particular vantage point of themselves, their communities, and the social and political context of which they are a part, even if those perspectives differ. And so, of course, young people should always be engaged as important stakeholders in both the local and global contexts of the climate crisis, which applies to youth workspaces as well. So when youth workers acknowledge and engage youth as experts of their own experiences, then young people ultimately have more access to defining and advocating for themselves what well-being means for them. And our last key understanding is that youth workers' well-being in relation to the climate crisis matters too. We know that youth workers are often overlooked as important contributors to youth well-being. And yet, relationships between youth and youth workers are what make youth work such a profound, dynamic, and possibly liberatory space for young people. Youth workers can share their values, concerns, and priorities in relation to the climate crisis, all the while being cautious of inadvertently influencing youth. So, as much as youth work spaces can provide an opportunity for non-hierarchical relationships, we also understand that there's a complexity there, that youth workers still do hold a position of power in youth's lives. So being cognizant of this platform, this position of power, this power dynamic is really important. Okay, so 5 promising practices. Number 1, let youth lead. Youth workers should position and understand themselves as allies, not leaders, alongside youth in relation to the climate crisis. As we mentioned, the climate crisis is a relational issue. Youth and youth workers are part of complex ecosystems that connect us to land, to water, and to non-human species, and of course to each other. By letting youth lead, youth workers can tap into the liberatory potential of youth work by leveraging their power, positions, and resources in allyship. Number 2, connect a young person's experience to the broader social issues of the climate crisis. Invite youth to have a voice in the climate crisis at the local level by engaging them emotionally, intellectually, creatively, politically, and environmentally. For example, youth workers can develop programming that is aimed at exploring and affirming youth's emotions related to the climate crisis, or get involved in local climate justice advocacy initiatives, create youth governance structures like a youth council to intentionally redistribute power in youth workspaces, or build a community garden and integrate climate education into programs. And something that I really love about community gardens are their potential for intergenerational learning, potentially with elders within the community. Number 3, develop programming that is reflective of and responsive to youth climate values. So youth should see themselves reflected in youth work programming, policy, and practice. Engage youth in program design, facilitation, and evaluation, and in policy development. I think back to my times as a youth worker and the number of times I developed a program that I thought was super cool and that the youth would really be into. And then when I received feedback from the youth, I actually had gotten it all wrong, and found that, youth are generally much more receptive to ideas that come from youth. And that makes perfect sense. Youth-led programs could explore an exploration of or response to the climate crisis, and peer-led discussion groups can create opportunity for youth to enact their agency. And when we talk about youth agency, we conceptualize it and understand it as something that is inherent to youth. Agency is not granted to youth by adults in positions of power in their lives. In fact, we all have inherent agency to determine for ourselves what our values are, what we would like to see for the future of the climate crisis, how we'd like to participate. At the same time, we understand that youth agency is constrained and limited by barriers that exist within the social structures and systems that we all live within. So youth workers can play a really important role in resisting these barriers in order to bolster youth agency. Number 4, affirm and validate youth responses to the climate crisis. Relationships between youth and youth workers are distinct from relationships that youth might have with other adults in their lives, which can include parents, caregivers, teachers, counselors, because of the potential for establishing non-hierarchical and genuine connections. So youth workers are uniquely positioned to sincerely affirm young people's worries, concerns, emotions, thoughts, priorities, and values relating to the climate crisis. And so in my work as a therapist and in my work as a social worker, I try to remain cognizant of the fact that there's a real risk in pathologizing these negative emotional responses to the climate crisis. If we think about anxiety or fear or symptoms of depression that young people are experiencing, that we ourselves may also be experiencing if we don't identify as young people, are actually really reasonable, and I would even argue adaptive responses to the severity of the threats associated with the climate crisis. And so I'm curious about what is possible when youth workers affirm these responses as reasonable and make space to validate and to listen, rather than trying to ease these concerns. So when we look at these negative emotions, we can also explore more around like what matters to us. Emotions give us information about our values, about what we care about. Emotions are an embodied connection to the world around us, to our communities, again, to non-human species and to the land. So again, it's not necessarily the youth worker's role to ease these concerns. By actively listening and validating young people's experiences and perspectives, youth workers can cultivate spaces where youth feel safe to express themselves. So like perhaps a more appropriate response might be something like, yeah, this is really scary, and like, what can we do together? What supports do you need? That kind of thing. And lastly, facilitate arts-based programming. I really love this one. This comes up in the research consistently. So engaging in art can support many positive outcomes related to youth well-being and can encourage exploration, reflection, and dialogue. When youth engage in art making, they may experience a deeper sense of connectedness to sustainability issues, and engagement with multiple ways of knowing about themselves and their communities. And they may identify new and or evolved social and political values and priorities. Art-based programming can support the myriad ways that youth relate to, are impacted by, and are caring about the climate crisis, and ultimately amplify youth voices and bolster youth agency. So that brings us to the end of our evidence brief, and I invite you, I believe that we sent it out, and if we didn't, I think we linked it in the chat, or if we didn't, then we will. I wasn't looking at the chat. I see there are 19 messages, so perhaps it was already linked there. The reference list is amazing. Again, thank you so much, Maria. The evolving research in this area is incredible, especially the youth-led research, and so I encourage you to take a look. And I will pass it back over to Katie. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Laura. If you have engaged with one of our evidence briefs in the past, you will know that more often than not, when we are summarizing evidence to try to find ways to make what's most important for youth workers known and practicable, that we're often affirming what youth workers may already know and may already be doing. And so I imagine that some of what we shared will affirm what you believe and how you approach your work, and maybe some of these understandings and practices have created some space for work going forward. So thank you so much, Laura. We're going to move right into the first part of our conversation. So I'm going to take this opportunity to have the remaining of our guests join Laura and I. Swelen Andari is the Senior Manager at Climate Resilience and Youth Mental Health at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. Willow Prince is the Education Coordinator with Indigenous Climate Action. Miriam Sarikaya is a member of Youth Climate Collective at Lakeshore Arts. Abe Singh Satchel is founder and executive director with Break the Divide, and Fraser Thompson is a staff lawyer at Eco Justice. So welcome, everyone. If you would like to read more about all of our guests, I encourage you to do so on our website. I have no doubt that there'll be time for us to get to know one another through this conversation. And I think, the first part of this conversation is really to sort of set some context for folks. And so we thought, asking you all from your perspective, from the work that you do, from your positions within the youth serving sector. And Miriam, as a young person, we wanted to start with you. Like, how are youth feeling about the climate crisis? How are you feeling? How are your peers feeling? What can you share with us?
Well, personally, I feel that climate change is definitely a big problem that needs to be solved. There's definitely a lot of action and a lot of work that needs to be done around it. And it's definitely something that cannot be solved overnight. We do need collective effort in order to improve the state of the climate change crisis that we're currently in. There's still a pretty long way to go, because some of the damage that we've done, such as like ocean pollution, that led to there's already a big garbage patch floating in the Pacific, so there's already some problem there. As for youth, well, I cannot speak for all youth, obviously, but from what I've seen, like just like from around like my school community and community outside of school, well, I've been seeing that like there are youth who care, who like genuinely care about like climate change and want to do something about it. And I have seen like more reusable items being used lately and a lot more garbage and more waste disposed bins being seen, which is a great sign. Yay! Like where you can dispose like compost, recycling, paper, and all that different kind of stuff. Reusable bags, reusable water bottles. I've been seeing a lot of that recently, so yay. But I have a feeling that youth, like they probably some of them probably don't think like what they're doing is enough. Singularly just as one person. Like they may or may not think like what they're doing may not have as big as an impact because they're just one person out of billions. What impact could they possibly have? And as for my education, as I've seen like over like the past few years, climate change, like in my past years back when I was elementary, it wasn't really touched upon as much. But like as I, furthered in my education, there was like when I was doing online school, we did go over like a portion of our science unit on climate change. And then just last year, like I just started high school last year, and the only time we went over climate change was like briefly during our biology unit. So that's how much I've been exposed to, and like lots of people have probably been exposed to throughout school. But other than that, that's what I believe youth are like, probably being exposed to and what feel about climate change right now.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm inviting other folks who want to share, what youth are feeling or how the climate crisis is showing up in your work with youth.
I can maybe jump in.
Please, yeah.
Right now, I'm not working directly with youth, so then what I'm speaking about is more grounded on some of that research that Laura was referring to. I had the chance to read a lot about what's coming up, and there's so much research happening around the world, but also here in Canada. And we know, for instance, that so in Canada, what we're hearing is that young people, there was a survey that came out last year, for example, there were 1,000 youth that were surveyed. And from all of them, like 73% of them reported that they were afraid about the future. And like 78 of them said that that climate change is affecting their overall mental health. So we really, and there's so many other studies out there that are showing this. And so like what I think that that's speaking to is that a lot of young people's well-being around climate change, that it's already being impacted. And it varies obviously based on where you live.
I think that's such a great point, and it's great to be here with everyone. I think when I'm thinking of young people, as a young person myself, and having been involved with climate action for a while now, like I remember when I was in elementary school and I heard about climate change for the first time, and when I was in high school, and we talked about climate change a lot. I'm from BC, and so this understanding of the environment, this is going to sound like the most BC thing ever. This understanding of the environment was really like an integral part of how education was sort of done in my school. And I was very lucky for that. Like just having these mornings where it would be like super rainy and misty, and I'd go outside and it was like 10 degrees and it was perfect. Like those experiences, and the fact that those are some experiences that now, like I feel like I have lost in BC in the summers, like when it's no longer as cool as it used to be. And I think that experience for me personally, for example, it's actually a term called solastalgia, which refers to a place-based homesickness that one might experience. And I think through my experience in my work, starting Break the Divide, the nonprofit, and I'll chat more about Break the Divide in a bit. We've worked with young people in high schools across the country and around the world, actually. And without even talking about emotions when we started out, we talked about local experiences with climate change. And in facilitating conversation about local experiences of climate change, what often came up again and again and again was this feeling of loss, that something is being lost. So it's not just anxiety about the future, it's a sense of loss of what we're used to, or loss that we're worried about for the future. And I think that's actually really interesting to know. In research that I conducted with Dr. Ashley Consolo and Cheryl Lee Harper, who have led a lot of research in the space of eco-grief. In 2021, I talked to 31 young climate activists across the country. And speaking to climate activists in particular, what I heard again and again was actually there are a lot of feelings of guilt and hypocrisy. And so this was something that Laura touched on briefly, that this question of like, what is the individual responsibility versus the collective responsibility is also worth noting. And I think over the years, as I've sort of navigated my own journey, like dealing with climate emotions and thinking about climate emotions as a very vast field where the emotional responses can range from anxiety and loss and soul nostalgia to grief and anger and frustration and betrayal and hopelessness and helplessness, but also the emotions that come with taking action or being in community, like feeling hopeful, feeling connected. What I've often seen is that as the young people that I've worked with have sort of grown from being in high school to being in the university age to being in their late 20s, for example, like the experiences on what climate action looks like has also changed. And so in high school, when I often talk to youth that we work with at Break the Divide, I hear that it feels really good to be involved on the ground, to be building a community rain garden, to be at local, school board meetings talking about policy. When I talk to youth in sort of university, though, what I often hear is that that no longer feels like that's enough. That as an individual, it doesn't feel worthwhile to just go and plant some trees because our politicians aren't taking action. And so I'm really interested to hear what others think on this, but just this balance between youth at different ages will have different emotional reactions based on understandings of the world and experiences with betrayal. And so while we're experiencing the impacts of climate change, as youth grow up in this world now, we're also experiencing more denial, more sort of straight out lies from politicians. And I mean, even the debates that we're having today in Canada about carbon pricing, for example, I think, it's a really great example of the ways that young people continue to be gaslit in a sense on what our future can look like and what it should look like. And I think, while it's critical for young people to take autonomy and take action, without intergenerational support, our emotions are going to continue to be, yes, those very rational responses that meet the scale of the crisis. But I often worry that without larger institutional shifts, these emotions can be resolved at sort of a surface level, but those deep-rooted problems, the fact that there is a climate crisis, that's not going away. And so what do we do about that? So I'm very interested in what others on this panel have to say about this. And I'm already super excited for this whole discussion.
But in order to get to those emotions, those feelings, the impacts on mental health, it seems like even from what Miriam was describing, there needs to be some intentionality about creating space for those conversations. I don't know who would like to maybe speak to how do you go about creating intentionally those spaces for these kinds of conversations to surface these feelings, and an extension of that is also how do you balance, as Laura said, affirming fears, anxieties, confusion, while also creating space for hope. So I don't know, Willow, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I can. Thanks, Katie. Hi, everyone. My name is Willow Prince. I am carrier deck from Nak Asli Watan, otherwise known as the place where arrowheads fly. For the past few years, I've been living on the lands of the Lekwungen speaking peoples in so-called Victoria on Vancouver Island here in British Columbia. Before getting into this Indigenous climate justice work, I come from a background of emergency mental health response and Native child and youth mental health care. And so, yeah, I think it's really important to remember where we came from in terms of our ancestral relationships to the land, to communities, and ultimately to ourselves. I think under colonization and capitalism, what we're suffering from is this really great divide from ourselves, and thus the connections to other people and this othering of the land that we experience as a result. And so we need to, it's our responsibility to reconnect to other people, to ourselves, to the land. And I think what needs to inform this notion of self-care is actually community care. I think there's a lot of responsibility and onus that's placed on individuals in the climate crisis to respond to climate justice, to, act right. But there's a very small number of people who are responsible for what we are facing. You know, this climate crisis that we speak about isn't this nameless, faceless killing machine. You know, like there are people and politicians that are responsible for this, and they all have names and they all have addresses. And so, where our solidarity must transcend colonial borders and break down these silos that colonization and capitalism have placed on us, our self-care must also reflect all of this. And so, self-care being community care, you know, and community care being intergenerational again as well, and really honing in and uplifting that inter-community transference of knowledge as well, because we're just not seeing generations speak to each other. You know, we're not seeing generations care for each other anymore. And so our self-care is actually community care, you know, and so like regulation and well-being as byproducts of the way we live our lives, like this must be intergenerational, you know, and we really need to work on like this transference of knowledge between elders and youth, I think is a really important thing. And I was just at this wellness gathering in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, and I was surrounded by a lot of elder love. And like elder love is absolutely the most powerful thing on earth. You know, it is the most healing thing. It holds the most space for all of us. And it's in those connections to those that came before us that we're actually able to dream and hope and create futures for those that come after us. Yeah, I'll pass it back to you, Katie.
No, I mean, that was beautifully said, Willow. I want to again create space for other folks to share how they navigate, you know, how the climate crisis is showing up. How do you create space for all of the feelings? How do you hold that space? How do you create that space intentionally?
I just have something brief that I can share in response, Willow, to what you were saying. As you were speaking at the end of what you were sharing, I was really imagining, you know, intergenerationalism also including like relationships across space and time, like expanding so much beyond the present moment. And that made me reflect a lot on what my responsibility is to past generations, but also generations that come after me. And I really, really love and appreciate that framing. So I just wanted to share that brought up some emotions and commitments for me when you were speaking. So thank you.
And maybe one of the things that comes up for me is, and most of my work right now with youth is with youth climate activists and who are pretty involved in these issues and spend a lot of time thinking about them, is really just that sense of urgency with everything. And so just resonates so much with what everybody said about what feels right for me. And then I think what I've seen in youth is just how important it is to create space for youth to feel emotion and to really validate that. And I know Laura was talking about how normal they are. And one of the things in my work, I work a lot with climate scientists, and I notice the two groups of people that feel the most threatened and worried about the climate crisis are youth and climate scientists. So these are extremely valid perspectives that youth are bringing to the table. There's obviously a lot of adults that are worried, but you know, these are very valid concerns. And one of the things I've noticed is just the value of connection. And Willow was saying that, and just making sure that as youth workers, being able to create space for that urgency and to hold that urgency as well, to validate that, because I think that idea that, you know, there's no time for my feelings is such a common experience, and just acknowledging that, like, you know, that's a great way to burn out. Someone who's been doing climate work for 25 years, I can speak to that definitely, and it's just a very valuable thing to perspective to try and make sure that, yeah, those feelings are validated.
We know there's a continuum of mental health and well-being, and we want to safeguard youth mental health. But the feeling of helplessness or hopelessness, is it enough to hold space to like sit with a young person in those feelings? would you advise a youth worker to try to re-steer or redirect or support a young person in shifting those feelings? I'm just curious. I know you've shared a few strategies for how we can hold space, but I'm curious. I know that that question comes up a lot. How do we confront feelings of helplessness or hopelessness?
I can jump in a little bit around that note, and also I guess connect it a little bit to this notion of creating intentional spaces where actually we also support storytelling, because I think that when we are allowing for a space that welcomes these stories to emerge, and then these feelings inevitably will also transpire, including perhaps the fear and the hopelessness or the despair. I think that first of all, I mean, in my experience, what I've learned too is that, I mean, through storytelling, we can also capture a little bit what are the kinds of mindsets that young people are holding about how they are seeing themselves projected out into the world. And so we know that perhaps we will encounter, and we know also that the research is telling us that there is a lot of hopelessness out there. And I think that the first step is to make space of it. But I think that ensuring that we're able to then shift and allow for opportunities to shift the kinds of mindsets that young people are holding about the future. So then the stories that they're telling can also be ones that can be grounded in what we hope for the future. Because I think we have an opportunity here to also invite young people to imagine and to actually like challenge what this reality is telling us, and that we can actually create a new future, and one that is actually not that separate from perhaps the past, like from the histories that this land has been, actually built upon around Indigenous knowledge. And so I think there's an opportunity for us to, yes, validate the feelings, as Laura said earlier, and absolutely seeing them as sources of power, is if anything as a calling. Like, you're feeling like this because there's something wrong. And let's listen to that, so then we can root ourselves into what is it exactly that we need to be doing right now? What is the calling for? And I think joining each other, joining the land, joining really also like others that are young, but also that are older on this path, is really part of this transition that we need to be making. So I think this is also not something that you need a degree for. I think this is something that we can all do, and we really need to elevate that. So yeah, those are just some thoughts around that.
Swelen, I really appreciated like what you were just saying about how like powerful our emotions are, and that like it is our responsibility to build worlds with these emotions. I think our like knee-jerk reaction is to pull people out of these feelings, like no matter how dark or deep or scary they are, but we need to let folks feel these emotions, and like Laura was saying in that presentation earlier about how our emotions like let us know about our value systems. And like Swelen was just saying, like emotions let you know that something is very wrong, and I think at some point we have to stop trying to rework or change these cycles that brought us into all of this harm. And we just need to focus on building new worlds. Like we don't know what they're going to look like because it will be totally different from anything we've ever seen and known, but we're going to know what it feels like because we know what our liberation feels like, and we know what like well-being feels like. And it has to do with the land, and it has to do with community, and yeah, our emotions are incredibly powerful and world building. And I think rage more than anything is so justified in what we're facing and experiencing right now, because, as an Indigenous youth myself, like I don't think angry does my feelings justice, because I'm more than furious that I was born into these systems. I'm furious that I was born onto a reservation in the sacrifice zone of what was once a very abundant land. And so this rage that we're feeling and experiencing about how wrong everything is, like this is not just our rage. This is my mother's rage. This is my grandmother's rage. And yeah, it's just this deep-seated knowledge that we deserve better, and that like we need to be better as a result, and I think it's also really infuriating that like the response is continually displaced onto the shoulders of tomorrow. You know, like we can't expect youth to respond to this and expect youth to carry us into freedom, because that is not the responsibility of a youth. Youth deserve to be kids. You know, we shouldn't have like kids on the front lines. We shouldn't have like kids in these big spaces and these big words. Like kids need to be kids, you know? And so this work, what we're doing is like allowing for these next generations of kids and grandkids to just be kids, you know, like they do not need to grow up before their time. They do not need to be harmed by all of these systems. Like we're doing this work so kids can be kids again.
Just to jump in on that point on like intentional spaces, spaces where we allow young people to be open and to talk about themselves. I think within the context of climate emotions, it's also important to recognize that the ways that different youth will talk about climate emotions, like different people might use different language to talk about how they're feeling. And so like some people might not say that they're feeling anxious or scared, but might talk about how they're worried about, you know, their grandparents and their grandparents that live far away, and how the next heat wave is going to impact them. It might be worrying about, you know, your extended family's farm in a different country. I know that at Break the Divide, one of the key things that we've been doing over the past 4 years now has been connecting young people across the country to engage in local conversations about climate change. So our Climate Emotions program that we've launched in February of this year connects 7 pairs of high schools across the country with one another. So one pair that we actually have going is youth in Surrey, BC, with kids in rural Ontario. I forget the specific city. And it's been very interesting. Surrey, my hometown, is a very diverse community. It's a largely South Asian community made of a lot of sort of immigrants and South Asians that have been in Canada for 2 or 3 generations now. And this community in Ontario is an overwhelmingly white community, but experiencing the impacts of climate change in many different ways. And in these conversations that these high school students have had with one another, that our youth dialogue facilitators have been hosting, so much has come out about just, again, this idea of like disconnection, feeling like you're not a part of climate dialogues already. But I think one really key part of this entire process has been community building, learning what it means to be a part of a community in terms of your own physical geography, but then building that connection with youth across the country. And I think those sorts of connections can also be incredibly powerful and empowering when it comes to climate emotions, that, you know, I might be feeling isolated and alone, but when I also connect with other youth that are feeling that way, that creates power and that creates energy. And it allows us to listen to our emotions. If it's not just me, if it's many of us that are experiencing these emotions, that must mean something. And so I think that point on our emotions reflecting our values is so important in this context, because at Break the Divide, what we've been really trying to do is connecting emotions, community, identity, and climate experiences. And this framework of really looking at community and identity allows us to engage with our local and community-based ways of knowing, and in connecting with different communities and different ways of knowing. I mean, again, I just get excited talking about it and thinking about the different types of knowledge that we can engage with. And so in particular, one program that, and this is a bit of a plug here, that we're launching over the next few months in downtown Toronto, actually, is our Climate Emotions and Community Building Fellowship. And this is a program that is specifically focused on hosting climate emotion circles and facilitating study circles with international students and newcomer youth in downtown Toronto. One of the big questions that I and my team have had is this question of, what does it mean to actually want to take climate action? How do people decide to take climate action? And in talking to many international students and immigrant youth in Toronto, one of the main experiences that we heard was like, I don't want to take climate action because I don't feel like I'm a part of the climate here. Like I don't care enough to. And so creating spaces again where we allow people to bring their identities, their communities, and their entire backgrounds, their entire histories and their own like connections, their own knowledge systems to spaces where then they can then engage with climate and emotions. I think that's really important in this entire context too. And I think it really reflects just this entire conversation that we've had, that, you know, none of this can really exist in isolation. We can't just put youth in a room and say, okay, well, are you worried about the future? What do you want to do about that? Instead, I think it's a more of a transformative process that allows people to go on their own journeys of learning about their emotions, learning about how they relate to emotions and climate, and then determining what they do, and not being prescriptive, but allowing youth for that opportunity to explore as well.
Yeah, and I know that, we had Robyn perform to open this event, and I know Laura talked about arts-based approaches, and Swelen, you mentioned storytelling, and just how do we process and understand and express our emotions. And I know, Miriam, at Youth Climate Collective, a lot of the work that you do is arts-based. I'm wondering if you want to speak a little bit about, the importance of arts-based approaches in your climate activism and in your ability to process and think about and channel how you're feeling or express how you're feeling.
Well, I do believe that art, like especially what like we do at Lakeshore Arts, is definitely like a wonderful way to express how one's feeling about climate change or just any topic in general without necessarily using words. And just to like piggyback on what like a few of us others said earlier about like creating that community, like that we're not alone, like when trying to like connect with a problem. That's probably one of the main reasons why youth, what I've been noticing and I experienced it myself, don't speak out about it in the first place. Because just asking it straight out and just asking like, hey, how do you feel? Like they probably feel like they're alone and they're the only ones who care about like this. And they probably don't want to speak up about it because they feel like they're probably going to be left out about it. And what I like about Lakeshore Arts is that there's that community of like not just one person, but like many people who care about the same issue, especially in Youth Climate Collective. And you get to like work on different projects together. And I discovered Lakeshore Arts throughout the peak of COVID, back when I was like in online school. And one of the first things, like our first like project, a personal project that I got to work on was like creating like this little exhibit where we got to make like little thought bubble paintings and like we were writing like facts about climate change, which were like printed onto the wall. And like we got to have like people at the end to visit and come see like our artwork and like the facts that we've learned about climate change and how we feel about it. And I thought that was like kind of like impactful in a way because like people actually come in and see like what like youth are feeling about it. And I thought that was pretty impactful. Also, I've also done like this other workshop series with CGRU. Robyn, who was also one of our wonderful mentors. And we got to create a podcast series, which were broadcasted on CGRU Live. I'm pretty sure they're still up there on SoundCloud if you go hunting down there. And it was definitely a wonderful way to express how we're feeling about climate change through visual arts, but also like through the format of a podcast. Like, I know podcasts is like, they can be about like lots of different subjects and stuff, but I wrote mine in the form of a narrative, not necessarily like in the form of like, I don't know, a factual contextual piece. And that's what I like about art, like what Lakeshore Arts does.
Fraser, I'm thinking about the work that you do with young people, which may seem very different from the kind of storytelling and art making that Miriam's talking about in terms of that type of format or form for expressing, processing emotion. And I'm wondering, like, how at EcoJustice have you and your team had to sort of reorient some of your approaches to working with clients in order to, do what we have suggested, which is to center and affirm young people's experiences and young people's feelings.
Yeah, it's been a really amazing journey for context for folks. I work with an environmental law charity named EcoJustice, and we're involved in a youth-based climate constitutional challenge against the Ontario government. And essentially what we're trying to do is we're representing youth in court, trying to say that their fundamental rights under the charter are being violated by some of the things that Laura was talking about, how climate is impacting youth directly and disproportionately, and in particular Indigenous youth. And so this is a new experience for our organization. Our organization has not worked with youth in any capacity before. And there was definitely some tension around all of these things that we've been talking about, where on one hand, we know that for youth, it can be really empowering to the youth that we work with, have been involved in the environmental justice, the Indigenous rights movement. They're doing a lot of this work. And so being able to support that in court can be empowering. And that was kind of the intention. On the other hand, you know, we're a large organization, we're lawyers, we're the ones speaking for youth in court. There's obviously a risk of wanting to make sure that we were doing justice to those stories, that, you know, that the legal system is colonial. There's a lot of limits to what it can do. It can't solve this problem in its entirety, but it can help take steps. And we know that working with youth, that could be traumatizing to be involved with. And so there was a lot of tension around that. It's been a real learning experience, and some of the things that we've really tried to do is just really focus on learning from the youth and connecting with the youth and building relationships with the youth far more than any of our other clients. And maybe that's something we can apply to our other clients, but we spent a lot of time just listening to the youth and connecting with them, and just having like weekend gatherings where we just would spend time and just learn what they wanted to get out of the case, and also trying to center their stories. We talk about the case in the media in terms of like the Constitution and all of those things, but largely we're trying to lead with their stories. And I think it's been interesting, and like as someone who's socialized as a lawyer within the legal system, there's a ton of power dynamics that were at play in that relationship, and obviously you'd have to talk to the youth to hear their perspective on it. But it's been a really good learning experience for me, because the reality is that as lawyers, you know, we do have specialized knowledge in terms of navigating the legal system. But the reality and the beautiful thing that youth bring to this case around storytelling is, at the end of the day, the law is you're trying to convince one person or three people that your case is right. And that is a story, like however you strip it down. And there's been some amazing examples of youth telling, giving us feedback and saying like, no, we want the story presented in this way. And there's this amazing, when we first presented it to the judge, one of the youth had suggested that it was when we were on Zoom, and all of the youth, normally on a Zoom hearing, the clients don't show up, and they were like, no, I want the judge to see us. So we had this really like kind of solemn situation where all of the youth just came on. They didn't say anything. The judge was able to see them. And it was a really incredible experience that came from them, and that was a reflection of how they wanted to be heard in court. It's probably a long-winded answer, but yeah, just a little bit of perspective from the work that I've been involved with.
Anyone else want to speak to experiences that they have had in having to reorient or recenter their work? Because here you have a situation, Fraser, where, you know, you and your team, you're leveraging resources, you're allowing youth to lead, you're attempting to be allies, and not necessarily leaving it entirely to young people, but working together. And sounds like there's knowledge sharing all around. Does anyone else want to speak to examples of how they've approached that in their practice, or in their work, or in their relationship building? Because obviously relationship building is so important to youth work generally, and also something that can be challenging.
I was actually going to ask Swelen a question, although for full transparency, I'm definitely riffing here, so Swelen hasn't heard this question yet. But if I can have your permission to ask a question, Swelen, of course, that you can answer or not. I was really excited to see the Toronto Star article discussing your new role. It actually, I think, was one of the first times that I've seen a mental health hospital or public health talk about climate change, mental health and well-being, and young people in the way that article really took it up. You know, like centering youth agency, talking about reasonable responses to the climate crisis. And I know that your role is quite new, and also that you have a background in as a therapist and in climate activism. And so I'm just curious to know what that's been like working in a mental health context, and having this topic area being focused on in this way. Yeah. Not to put you on the spot.
No, it's totally fine. Thank you so much for your question, Laura. It's a good question. It's been a very, honestly, a really positive experience, which I didn't necessarily know what to expect when I like I've been working at CAMH, the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, which is Canada's largest mental health and addictions hospital, for those of you that maybe are not familiar with it. And it's a really big institution, and it really holds, honestly, it holds a lot of power in the system. And so I have been part of it for 9 years almost, and I've always worked with youth, and I never necessarily knew that I could bring in this climate justice lens into my work. But I think that the relationships that I have built within CAMH, especially with like across, like with staff, with leadership, with community members connected to the hospital, like I feel like because those relationships have been, you know, deep, and because I've been there for a long time, I think that that has really allowed for there to be a really open reception to this work. It really speaks to the power of relationships and connection that we're talking about here. I think that, I mean, overall, I've received a lot of support. People are trying to help as much as they can. And every day I get a new colleague calling me, being like, hey, how can I be part of this? So if anything, what I'm finding is that a lot of people are very interested in this work, and maybe they haven't been given the opportunity to do it. And so what I'm excited about is actually how can we actually not only build a bit of a movement within CAMH, but actually across systems like health and social support systems, because we are I think the climate conversation has not necessarily infiltrated the health and social support and mental health system as it could be, and now it's like starting, and it's really exciting. But I think it's an opportunity too, that because I've been able to touch other spaces outside of my mental health job, like, you know, being part of climate justice movements, and like, I think it's an opportunity for us to find a way to actually reignite what the mental health system needs to be prioritizing at this moment. And so if like we are to be centering the climate conversation, how do we make sure that it's not pathologized? Like, how do we make sure that it's community wisdom that is really being included? How do we make sure that we're working in real partnership that's equitable, empowering, and respectful with Indigenous communities? Like, we need to be doing things differently. So I think it's just it's been really exciting to feel like this could maybe be an avenue through which we can experiment doing work differently and more equitably. And so yeah, I think that the climate conversation can change our system if we let it. So those are some thoughts. Happy to share more in the future.
Thank you, Swelen.
Yeah, I think we had talked about, Swelen, how, you know, can the climate crisis be a unifying issue for supporting mental health of youth across systems? And also, you know, in my conversations with other folks too, in preparing for today's conversation, we talked about how climate justice intersects with other social justice issues. So does anyone else want to speak to that idea of the climate crisis or climate justice as a unifying issue?
Climate justice, I think, when we begin to examine and unpack some of the intricacies at play in the climate crisis, we become aware of all of the intersections that are at play, you know? And so we have intersections around age, around gender, around our like cultural backgrounds. And what we're seeing in this climate crisis and this increasing amount of these 1 in 1,000-year weather events that we're going to now experience pretty much every other week at this point, what we're seeing in that is that the climate crisis is ushering in this era of like climate refugees, you know, like we're going to see it, like entire places become inhospitable and unlivable. And a lot of these climate events will also be mass scale disabling events. And so when we talk about climate justice, we're talking about disability justice, you know, we're talking about reproductive justice. And I think what's really important to ground ourselves in this conversation is that our bodies are an extension of the land, you know, and how we treat our bodies is, of course, how we treat the land. And I think of a lot of these systems and ways of living that have been imparted on us under colonization just lead to really inflamed states of the body, inflamed states of the mind, and inflamed states on the land. And so these weather events, you know, these heat domes or forest fires, like those are alive and well somewhere in our own bodies, you know, and how we are responding to our bodies in response is how we're treating and responding to the land. And so like climate justice is everything, you know, that's Indigenous justice, that's reproductive justice, that's disability justice. And so yeah, it's really important that we come to an intersectional understanding of climate justice and who is disproportionately affected, you know. And I think in the response as well, like, you know, when we have like pipeline protesters or frontline resistances to new oil and gas projects on unceded Indigenous lands, we have like, what was I? Yeah, so it's very comprehensive. And so with the like those on the front lines, typically the youth on the front lines are Indigenous and Black youth, you know, and typically femme or two-spirited and non-binary queer youth as well on the front lines. And so we need to acknowledge and uplift those that are putting their bodies and lives down on the lines for all of us, you know. And we also need to make sure that our response and our support supports those that are fighting for the rest of us, you know. Like there are no structural supports for those that like, yeah, have really impacted bodies and minds and spirits from frontline resistances and responses. And after leaving really intense situations with the state, they're left without supports, you know, and they're left to fall through the cracks of colonization and of capitalism. And so we need to just make sure that we're examining everything with an intersectional lens and trying to mitigate some of these long-standing social inequities with those that are incredibly disproportionately affected by the climate crisis, such as Black and Native bodies.
Just want to quickly jump and say that, Willow, that really, really resonates, and thank you so much for sharing that. I completely agree that we need to be looking at this through an intersectional lens, at these issues as intersectionally connected, but also that the solutions are intersectionally connected. Like the climate solutions are not green solutions only. Like this is like a social and cultural and spiritual issue too. So I think that if we were to look at all the solutions as a way as building co-benefits or like multiple benefits that amplify reconciliation, to amplify you know, mental health and climate action and well-being, like in addressing inequalities, and those are the things that we need to be thinking about. So yeah, just a plug for that.
And I think that really speaks to this idea of world building that I think, Willow, you were talking about, that building worlds based on our emotions. And I often find that we are so often in climate spaces in particular, talking about the doom and the gloom, like the negative, the fact that we are not in a good place in terms of the trajectory of the climate timeline. Like, you know, it's not exciting. I was actually at COP28 in Dubai in December, and like being on the ground, listening to negotiations, like that was not a fun experience for me, honestly. Just hearing again this idea that we can delay action. And so what I find often is much more helpful than thinking about the doom and gloom. And I think this speaks to how we need to shift our climate education, the ways that in the media, in our news, we talk about climate, is focusing on solutions, focusing on the hope, focusing on the futures that we want to build, and using our emotions, but also using our understandings of these like multi-layered issues and how they're connected to do that.
Maybe I'll just add really quickly that one of the things that makes me optimistic about working with youth is that, at least in my role, is the reciprocity in terms of what youth can bring to the table. And that, you know, I find in my experience with working with youth, they're able to see through some of these like inherent biases I have, that things need to remain the same, and they're a lot more optimistic, and they can bring that different perspective. And so yeah, as much as it's about supporting youth, I think it's also thinking about how we're in a relationship with youth in this work, and some of the ways that they can really support us as well.
And we do have a hand raised, an Angel. We are still recording, but if you are comfortable sharing your question, and I'm imagining you want to respond to something that was recently shared by one of our guests, so I don't want to wait. So please.
Hi, can everyone hear me okay? There's some construction going on my street, so I apologize if there's some noise in the background. I first want to say that I'm definitely like in my elder era, but I spent my entire career. I started out as an ecologist on the East Coast in Nova Scotia. And so I remember in the 90s talking about concern for like ecosystem collapse and climate change due to coastal ecology systems collapsing, the cod fishery, the salmon, and the East Coast, the fisheries. The salmon in the West Coast, for example, lots of stuff going on in Turtle Island and calls around crises around how our forests were managed at that time and even earlier. And hearing from elders, Indigenous elders who used to come to my grade schools and into my universities talking about these same things, you know, with huge generosity and really echoing the things that I think are finally being heard in the past maybe 20, 25 years or something like that. And right now I'm in the process of finishing up our therapy degree, working on eco-psychotherapy, because as an ecologist and then just looking at larger society, I just really wonder about what's going on in our collective and individual psyches. And so when I started, like in the late 90s or I sound like a fossil and I probably am, but like I was told to, in doing conservation work, I've worked internationally and on the East Coast, to just not expect to see the impact that I hope to see and to work to develop resilience, that I'm not going to see the results of the outcomes that I want to achieve, which is conservation, which is like the cod fishery it's not back, right? There's not the old growth forest that exists in Nova Scotia has not grown. For example, the species that I studied internationally are closer to extinction than when I started. And it hasn't changed. You know, I'm one of the scientists that go into schools and talk to youth. I graduated from the University of Toronto. And we still have these conversations. And so what I would love to see in the future, and it's a request, if not a plea, is to invite the frontline ecologists and workers who are doing this work and get their perspectives, right? And it's actually like, I can speak from my perspective. Being on a coastline or being in any rainforest or forest anywhere is just pure joy. Like it's pure joy. And when I bring young people in, I work primarily with queer youth in downtown Toronto, we go into our green spaces and we talk about healing and we talk about what is the separation between the earth and us. And what is human ecology versus ecology? I love, Laura, that your definition of climate change is so, from what I learned and as a scientist, quite broad as like a ecologist, let's say, because you're a scientist as well. But like, it's just really broad, and that's really amazing because we weren't always allowed formally to bring in our whole bodies and our whole psyches and selves into the work. But I queered every space that I have ever been in. I was born in Delhi and I grew up in Delhi, and yay to Punjabis, but like I brought all of it in because we don't waste. We are like, it's a sin to waste in our cultures. We use all resources. We look and taste herbs wherever we are. Like, you know, there's things that my grandparents did that is like epigenetically coming through me, right? And so, and this is the time, and I was like definitely an oddball, but now is the time when there's much more receptivity. And when we talk about real reconciliation, to me, and what I speak with my fellow ecologists and mental health workers, we talk about it as like not just decolonizing, but indigenizing through what we come from, right? And then also lots of humility to the lands that we're on and the traditions that are here, then that will outlive us all, right? So I just wanted to share that because I feel like when we work, if we're working not just intersectionality, but intersectionally, but also interdisciplinarily, I think that's where we really need to, because the ecological, like I can see and pull the ecological things that you're talking about, because I view us all as part of the earth, right? And that is an indigenous view from Delhi and Punjab and on Turtle Island, like throughout Turtle Island. It's a universal truth that I think we forget, or that we don't want to hear, and that we're not necessarily educated to come through, but it is a universal truth. And please challenge me if I'm wrong. I would love to learn if I'm wrong, but I really do believe that through my body and my soul. So that's what I just wanted to say, is that like we have to realize that the battles are hard, and I do view it as a battle, taking on our colonial education system or political education, like all the systems, right? But when I sat down and thought about like, okay, what will actually create change in climate in ecologically, I was like, it's our political system is where I think, right? And taking on our legal system. But because we're bringing our whole selves, it's exactly the definition that you talked about around climate change, Laura. And I think that definition could, again, apply throughout sectors as well. So I wanted to thank you all and YouthREX for holding this and everyone's contributions. But I just wanted to come in from the other side, from the science side of things, or the pure, supposedly pure science or whatever, that we were actually trained. I remember first year and then throughout, like just don't expect to see the change and impact that you hope, but we have to keep going. And the reason that we keep going is just the pure joy to connect with some aspects of our land, right? Like the natural world. Thank you.
Does anyone want to speak to what Angel shared? If it sparked an idea? I realized we never took a break. I was very aware of this. I did not want to stop the momentum of the conversation. I do want to make sure everyone's taking care of themselves. Maybe what we can do is maybe we can stop recording and allow other folks who may want to share but may be intimidated by that